The heat in the Kuwaiti desert wasn't a feeling. It was a punishment. A thick, oppressive weight that stuck to my lungs and seeped into my very bones. I had been deployed for 13 months. 13 months of sand, tactical meetings, the constant drone of generators, and the sickening mix of anxiety and adrenaline that defined life in a combat zone. I was a captain of the U.S. Army, in charge of a logistics platoon. My job was to keep everyone supplied, but at my quietest moments, my only job was to survive. For my future. For the house I'd promised myself since I was a teenager. The VA loan entitlement, the golden ticket for military personnel to buy a house with no money down, was the thing I held onto, like a rosary. It was my reward for the months I spent away from the sun and the people I loved. I sent 90% of my paycheck home. Every month, a massive chunk of money flew over the Atlantic and landed in a joint savings account with my parents. I trusted them. They were my rock. My mom would email me recipes I'd never get to cook, and my dad would send me photos of the local football games I was missing. It was the only taste of normalcy I had. I didn't think to check the statement. I didn't think to look at the transactions. I was too busy keeping soldiers alive. I didn't know that while I was dodging mortar fire, my parents were dodging ethics, planning my future. Not my future, but the future of my younger, shiftless, unemployed brother, Leo. Leo, the golden child who had never worked a full day of his life, who at 25 was still living in my parents' basement, sleeping until noon and collecting government checks like they were participation trophies. When the plane landed at Fort Bragg, the air was cool, the trees were green, and I wanted to scream with joy. The welcome home ceremony was a blur of hugs, tears, and a colonel's speech that sounded like a song to me. I scanned the crowd. My parents weren't there. My stomach tightened, a familiar tactical knot that told me something was wrong. My mom had emailed me a week ago saying they couldn't make the drive. "Too long," she said. "Too much, but Leo is so excited to see you." I brushed it off. They were older. Drives were hard. I took a taxi to their house. The quiet neighborhood I grew up in felt too small now, too clean. I opened the front door, expecting the scent of home, Mom's pot roast, the old lemon cleaner she used. Instead, it smelled like stale cigarette smoke, expensive cologne, and failure. My parents were sitting in the living room, looking nervous. They didn't stand up to hug me. "Oh, Emily," my mom said, her voice strained. You're home, you look tired." "Deployment is tiring, Mom," I said, my tactical instincts screaming at me. "Where's Dad?" "He's the kitchen," my dad called out, his voice thin. I walked in. Dad was sitting at the table, a stack of papers quickly hidden under a placemat. "You're back, Em," he said, not meeting my eyes. "What's going on, Dad?" I asked, my voice getting cold. "Where's my welcome home party? And where are my savings statements? I need to start looking at my VA loan entitlement. I want to buy a place." The silence that room was heavier than the desert heat. They looked at each other. My mom looked at the placemat my dad had used to hide the papers. My dad looked at his hands. "Actually, Em," my mom began, her voice trembling. "We need to talk about your VA loan and about Leo." The knot my stomach tightened into a fist. My mind raced, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. They were talking about Leo, the golden child, the eternal failure, and my hard-earned military entitlement the same sentence. My tactical brain began processing scenarios, and every one of them ended a tragedy. My parents, the people who were supposed to be my protectors, were looking at me like I was a budget line item they'd just manipulated. I sat down at the kitchen table, the air that quiet house suddenly too thick to breathe, and I knew, with a certainty that was more terrifying than any combat scenario, that my deployment wasn't over. I had just entered a new theater of war, and this time, the enemy knew all my secrets. The story came out fits and starts, like a broken engine trying to turn over. My mom was crying, my dad was arguing with himself, and every word they said was a fresh bullet my heart. The plan was simple, brutal, and entirely illegal. While I was deployed, Leo had found a luxury mansion, a $700,000 property a nearby expensive suburb. It had a 6-car garage, a home theater, and a pool. Leo wanted it. He wanted it, but he had a credit score lower than my platoon's collective blood pressure. He had no job, no history, and no future. My parents, their infinite love and compassion for their favorite child, had decided that my VA loan was the solution. They couldn't use theirs. It was tied to the house we grew up so they forged my signature. We forged your signature, Em, my mom sobbed. We didn't know it was that big of a deal. We thought you'd want to help your brother. They used my entitlement. They used my clean credit. They used my sacrifice. They used the VA loan to buy Leo his dream mansion, a place I had never seen, for a brother I had grown to resent. The papers my dad was hiding were the mortgage statements. I was officially the owner of a property I didn't know existed, tied to a $700,000 debt I hadn't agreed to. The savings account, depleted. The massive sums I sent home were the down payment and closing costs. "You're selfish," Leo had shouted, popping his head into the kitchen, looking flushed and wearing a cashmere sweater that was definitely paid for by my money. "I deserve to have a nice life. You have your military stuff. Why are you so anxious? You're an anxious soldier, Emily, lighten up." An anxious soldier. I wasn't anxious. I was trained. I was tactical. And now I was an owner of a $700,000 asset I couldn't use and a $700,000 debt I hadn't signed for. I was a soldier who had just been betrayed by her own command structure. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't throw things. That was Leo's behavior. I was a professional. My tactical brain kicked I process information and I react. I knew exactly what I had to do. "Okay," I said, my voice cold, calm, and direct. The tone I used a briefing. "Okay, I hear you, but this is illegal and it's a violation of my VA benefits. You're telling me I'm selfish, but I spent the last 13 months a combat zone while you forged my signature. This conversation is over." I packed my bag and walked out. They were shouting, but I didn't hear them. I went to the nearest hotel, and before I even checked I was on the phone. My chain of command had failed, so I activated my tactical support network. First, I called JAG, the military's base legal support. I told them I had a case of identity theft and financial fraud against a service member. I told them I needed help, not just to clear my name, but to take control of the situation. They told me to come the next morning. Second, I called the local sheriff's department. I reported my signature had been forged for a major financial document. I gave them the name of the bank and the details of the house. I made it clear that I wanted to file charges. The third call was to the bank my parents used to deplete my savings and finance the property. I informed them that the $700,000 mortgage my name was fraudulent. I told them my signature was forged. They didn't believe me at first. I told them to hold. I called my colonel, the one who gave the speech at the welcome home ceremony, and I asked him for support. I asked him to call the bank manager. He did. 10 minutes later, the bank's tone changed. The next morning, I was at the base legal office. The JAG officer, a young captain, looked at the forged signature on the mortgage papers I had secured from the county recorder's office. He shook his head disbelief. "They did this while you were deployed?" he asked. "This is open and shut for us, Captain. We can take this to the district attorney. We can make sure they're prosecuted, and we can help you reclaim the house." "I don't want to just reclaim the house," I said, a new tactical idea forming my mind. I didn't want the luxury mansion. I wanted a simple life. I wanted Leo to understand the cost of my anxious existence. I want them evicted. I want to sell the house. I want to reclaim my entitlement, and I want them to pay the price. "That's possible," the JAG officer said, a cold smile crossing his face. "This isn't a military court, Captain, but we can provide you with all the legal support and documentation you need for the district attorney. We'll show the forged papers, the bank records from your deployment period, and your deployment dates. It's an airtight case." I knew what my ultimate tactical payoff would be. It wasn't the mansion Leo loved. It was the final confrontation where they would finally understand that tactical revenge wasn't about anger. It was about logic. The case moved fast. The district attorney saw the evidence. The forged signature was a laughable attempt, and my deployment dates were ironclad proof. They charged my parents and Leo with conspiracy, financial fraud, and identity theft. My parents were terrified. Leo was laughing. He thought his parents' love would save him. "This is crazy," Leo shouted at the pretrial hearing. "You're our daughter, you're supposed to help." I looked at him, anxious soldier, tactical revenge, logic over emotion. "You forged my signature, Leo," I said, my voice calm, direct, and final. "You stole my entitlement. You used my sacrifice. The conversation about helping is over." The trial was a disaster for them. The judge was a woman whose own daughter was a Marine. She looked at my deployment photos, me F full gear, sandblast on my face, looking at my parents' photos on my laptop, and then at Leo, F his cashmere sweater and expensive cologne, F the luxury mansion my parents had stolen for him. "Forging a deployed service member's signature is a despicable crime," the judge said F her final ruling, her voice trembling with anger. "You exploited her sacrifice for your own luxury. The evidence is irrefutable." The final karmic payout was a masterclass F logistical timing. On Christmas Eve, I received the official order. My JAG officer had helped me file the papers, and the bank had been notified that the fraudulent mortgage was being shut down. I now owned the property free and clear, and a sheriff's order was generated. I called the local sheriff's department. I knew the timing would be devastating. It was Christmas Eve, the most emotional day of the year. Leo would be planning his normal Christmas party at my mansion. I met the sheriff's deputies outside the luxury property. It was as beautiful as Leo's description. A massive, modern mansion glowing with expensive Christmas lights. Inside, I could hear Leo's party music. "Are you sure, Captain?" the sheriff's deputy asked. "It's Christmas Eve." "I was deployed last Christmas Eve," I said, a cold logic F my voice. "The conversation about timing is over. Serve the papers." They did. The music stopped. The lights F the home were shut off, one by one. Leo and my parents were F the living room, surrounded by expensive gifts they'd bought with my money. "This is a mistake," my mom sobbed. "You can't do this on Christmas." I stood behind the sheriff looking at them. Tactical revenge, logic. "You forged my signature," I said. "You stole my life. Today I evicted you. The tactical discussion is over. The police are going to escort you from the premises." They were homeless on Christmas Eve. Leo, the golden child, was sobbing F his cashmere sweater, surrounded by his empty gifts. They finally understood the cost of tactical revenge, anxious soldier, a lesson F logistical karma. The end of my deployment was final. Justice had been served. The eviction on Christmas Eve wasn't the end of the war. It was merely the opening bombardment. When the tail lights of the sheriff's cruiser faded into the cold December night, leaving my family standing on the sidewalk next to their designer suitcases, I knew they would strike back. A toxic family dynamic doesn't dissolve just because a legal document is signed. It mutates. They had spent years treating me like a financial utility, an insurance policy wrapped in a camouflage uniform, and they weren't going to let their golden goose fly away without trying to clip her wings. 3 days after the eviction, while I was sitting in my temporary quarters at Fort Bragg trying to finalize the paperwork to return the fraudulent mansion to the bank and clear my name, my commanding officer, Colonel Vance, summoned me to his office. My stomach dropped into that familiar, cold survival pocket. In the military, an unexpected summons to the BC battalion commander is rarely a harbinger of good news. When I stood at attention in front of his mahogany desk, his expression wasn't the proud, welcoming one from the tarmac. It was grim, lined with the stress of administrative headaches. "At ease, Captain," Colonel Vance said, tossing a thick manila envelope onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "Care to explain what this is?" I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of pages of typed letters, printed text messages, and a formal complaint addressed directly to the Inspector General, IG, of the Army, copies of which had been sent to my entire chain of command. The letters were signed by my mother. They painted a picture of a ruthless, unhinged soldier who had used her military authority to terrorize her elderly parents and leave her civilian brother homeless during the holidays. They claimed I had promised them the house as a gift for taking care of my affairs while deployed, only to violently revoke it in a fit of post-deployment instability. They were trying to use my service, my stress, and the very concept of military trauma as a weapon against my career. They wanted me court-martialed, or at the very least, stripped of my security clearance. "They went to the IG, sir," I said, my voice maintaining its flat, tactical military bearing despite the fury boiling beneath my uniform. "They did," Vance replied, leaning back in his chair. "And because it involves allegations of financial misconduct and psychological instability of an active-duty officer, regulations compel me to initiate a formal 15-6 investigation. I've appointed Major Miller from the brigade staff as the investigating officer. Until this is cleared, your promotion to major is on hold, and your access to classified systems is suspended." This was their tactical counterattack. They couldn't win the civil courts, so they decided to destroy the only thing I truly cared about, my career. Leo's hand was all over this. He knew that a military investigation could stall my life for months, perhaps years. But they forgot one fundamental rule of engagement. An officer doesn't panic under fire. An officer collects intelligence, secures the perimeter, and counterattacks with overwhelming force. I saluted, walked out of the headquarters, and went straight to the CID, Criminal Investigation Division, office on post. If my family wanted a military investigation, I was going to give them a federal criminal case. I brought out the heavy artillery. I provided the CID investigators with the complete certified copy of the forensic handwriting analysis that my civil lawyer had commissioned, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the signature on the $700,000 VA loan document was a crude forgery executed while I was thousands of miles away in Kuwait. I provided my leave and earnings statements, LES, my official deployment orders, and the IP addresses from the emails my mother had sent me, showing she was intentionally misleading me about the state of my savings account. For 2 weeks, the 15-6 investigation hung over my head like a dark cloud. I was confined to administrative duties, watching my peers prepare for field exercises while I sat at a gray desk sorting through legal exhibits. My mother called me from a burner phone, her voice no longer sobbing, but venomous. "You think you're so smart with your uniform and your rules, Emily," she hissed. "We made you. We can break you. You drop the charges against Leo and hand over the equity from that house, or we will tell your bosses everything. We'll tell them you're crazy. We'll tell them the desert broke your head." "Mom," I said, my voice dead calm, recording the call through a secondary device I had set up on my desk. "The time for negotiations ended when you signed my name on a federal loan. Tell Major Miller whatever you want. I'll see you F-court." I hung up. I didn't get angry. I cataloged the audio file, added it to the digital folder labeled Exhibit E Extortion and Witness Tampering, and forwarded it directly to Major Miller and the civilian district attorney. In their desperation, they were handing me the rope to hang them with, one frantic move at a time. Because the VA loan is a federal benefit guaranteed by the Department of Veterans Affairs, the identity theft and mortgage fraud committed against me wasn't just a state matter. It crossed into federal jurisdiction. The United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina took over the prosecution. The indictment was unsealed early spring, and my parents along with Leo were hit with conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and wire fraud. The day of the evidentiary hearing arrived. The courtroom was a sterile environment of polished wood, high ceilings, and the oppressive silence of federal authority. I sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed my immaculate Class A Army service uniform, my medals pinned precisely, my hair tucked tight, the image of absolute discipline. Across the aisle sat my family. My parents looked older, withered by the realization that the federal government doesn't care about family dynamics or parental entitlement. Leo looked pathetic. His cashmere sweaters had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit his public defender had likely found for him. The arrogant smirk he wore on Christmas Eve was completely gone, replaced by a nervous twitch of his left eye. The prosecution's star witness wasn't me. It was the data. The federal prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney named Davis, walked the court through the digital footprint of the crime. "Your Honor," Davis said, projecting a massive spreadsheet onto the screen. While Captain Emily Vance was managing logistics under combat conditions at Camp Buring, her joint savings account, funded entirely by her military hazardous duty pay, was accessed 34 times from an IP address registered to the defendant's residence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a systematic extraction of capital to fund a lifestyle the defendants could not afford. Then came the moment they had been dreading, the handwriting expert. A seasoned forensic document examiner took the stand, displaying side-by-side comparisons of my actual signature from my military enlistment contracts and the signature on the $700,000 closing documents for the mansion. The signature on the mortgage document is a simulated forgery, the expert testified calmly. The stroke velocity is slow, indicating hesitation. It matches the natural writing habits of the defendant, Leo Vance, specifically F the formation of the letters E and V. The person who signed this document was looking at a copy of the captain's signature and trying to draw it. Leo shifted F his seat, his face turning an asymmetric shade of pale. His defense attorney tried to argue that it was a family agreement, that I had given verbal power of attorney over the phone during a chaotic call from the theater of operations. "Captain Vance, please take the stand," Prosecutor Davis called out. I walked up to the witness box, my boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. I took the oath, my hand steady on the Bible. "Captain Vance," Davis asked, leaning against the podium, "did you ever at any point give your parents or your brother verbal or written authority to utilize your VA home loan entitlement?" "Never, sir," I answered, looking directly at the judge, ignoring the burning stares from the defense table. "Did you ever authorize the withdrawal of $47,000 from your savings to secure the down payment on the property located at 1422 Riverview Drive?" "No, sir. Those funds were intended for my transition out of active service and the purchase of my own primary residence upon my return from deployment." Then Leo's attorney stood up for cross-examination. He tried to play the emotional card, trying to rattle me, to make me look like the anxious, aggressive soldier my family had claimed I was. "Captain, isn't it true that your brother Leo suffers from severe anxiety and depression, and that your family was simply trying to secure his stability while you were safely earning a government salary overseas?" The word safely hung off the air like an insult. I took a slow breath, letting my tactical discipline control my heart rate. "Sir," I replied, my voice carrying through the courtroom with absolute clarity, "my brother's mental health is a medical issue. Forging my identity to buy a luxury estate is a criminal one. I spent 13 months at a theater where safety was a luxury we didn't possess. My salary wasn't earned safely. It was compensated for the risk of my life. To have that risk exploited by an individual who refuses to seek employment isn't a family misunderstanding. It is grand larceny." A low murmur ran through the gallery. The judge nodded slowly, writing something down at her notes. At that moment, Leo snapped. The pressure of the federal evidence, the clinical destruction of his lies, and the sight of me standing there unbothered by his presence broke his fragile ego. He stood up from the defense table, knocking his chair backward with a loud crash. "You think you're better than me?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and childish panic. "Just because you wear that stupid suit, you have everything. The government gives you everything. I needed that house. Mom said it was fine. She said you wouldn't find out until it was too late. You ruined my life, Emily. You threw us out of the snow." "Leo, sit down," his attorney yelled, grabbing his arm, but the damage was done. My mother buried her face at her hands, weeping openly, while my dad stared at the table, completely broken. The judge didn't even raise her voice. She simply looked at the federal marshals standing at the back of the room. "The defendant will be seated and quiet, or he will spend the remainder of this trial administrative segregation. Let the record reflect the defendant's admission regarding prior knowledge of the lack of consent." Leo sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a spoiled, entitled parasite who had finally hit the concrete wall of reality. His sister wasn't the anxious little girl he could bully anymore. She was a captain of the United States Army, and she had just closed the trap. The federal judge didn't show mercy. The U.S. justice system takes a very dark view of individuals who prey on deployed service members, and the sentences reflected that severity. 3 months later, the final sentencing hearing was convened. My parents, due to their age and lack of prior criminal history, avoided immediate federal prison, but were sentenced to 5 years of federal supervised probation, combined with a mandatory restitution order of $47,000 to be paid back to me through the garnishment of my father's pension and their remaining assets. They were forced to sell the family home I grew up in just to cover the legal fees and the initial restitution payments, moving into a small, rented 2-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. The family structure they had tried to protect at my expense had been completely dismantled by their own greed. Leo didn't get off so easy. As the primary beneficiary of the fraud and the individual who physically forged my signature on the federal documents, he was sentenced to 36 months at a federal correctional institution, followed by 3 years of supervised release. When the marshals stepped forward to cuff him, his hands were shaking so violently they could barely latch the metal rings around his wrists. He looked back at my mother, crying out like a child being taken away to his room, but no one could save him now. He was finally going to a place where he would have to work, follow a schedule, and live under a chain of command he couldn't manipulate. As for me, the resolution of the federal case brought an immediate end to the military's 15-6 investigation. Major Miller's final report cleared me of any and all misconduct, stating that Captain Vance had acted with exemplary restraint, legal precision, and professionalism in the face of egregious criminal exploitation by her immediate family. The hold on my promotion was lifted. 2 weeks later, at a quiet ceremony in front of my platoon, Colonel Vance pinned the gold oak leaves of a major onto my chest. "Excellent work, Major Vance," he whispered as he shook my hand. "You handled that situation like a true commander." With my VA loan entitlement fully restored by the Department of Veterans Affairs after the fraudulent mortgage was legally voided, I finally used it for its true purpose. I didn't buy a $700,000 mansion with a home theater and a 6-car garage to impress people I hated. I bought a beautiful, modest 4-bedroom brick house on 2 acres of land near the base. It had a porch that faced the sunset, a massive kitchen where I could finally cook those recipes I'd thought about in the desert, and a quiet, secure perimeter where the sand couldn't reach me. On my first night at my new home, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fireflies rise from the grass. My phone sat on the table next to me, silent. There were no frantic text messages from my mother, no demanding emails from my father, and no insult-laden voicemails from Leo. They were gone, removed from my life with the clean, clinical precision of a surgical strike. The neighborhood was quiet, the air was cool, and for the first time since I had stepped off that plane from Kuwait, my heart rate dropped to a normal, peaceful rhythm. The deployment was over. The home front was secure. I had survived the betrayal, used their own greed to destroy them, and built my future on the ruins of their malice. I wasn't an anxious soldier anymore. I was a major, a homeowner, and the absolute commander of my own destiny. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been executed with tactical perfection.